This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Richard Eskow, RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we'll be talking about a lot of things in this program. Today, we'll be talking about the corrupting influence of money in politics. We'll be talking about how conservatives derail arguments about everything, even the fate of the planet and climate change, with irrational arguments. But before we get to that, I want to focus on a specific issue that came to my attention this week, which I wrote about this week. As you know, we're always fighting Social Security cuts here because I have a background in benefits here and in over 20 other countries, retirement programs, pension programs, health programs. And it's very striking to me to see that even though we have one of the weakest retirement programs in the developed world here in the United States, even though Social Security is insufficient to protect people's financial security, people keep trying to cut it in various different ways. There was the chained CPI, which the president agreed with the Republicans was a wonderful idea to cut Social Security benefits. It would have been, in fact, a pretty harsh benefit cut. He got pushback from his own party and his own base and took it out of his latest iteration of his budget, although we hear it's still on the table. Most Americans, as you may or may not know, you certainly know if you're a regular watcher of this program, most Americans would like to see their Social Security benefits expanded, not cut. Cutting Social Security is a very unpopular idea. It's a very bad idea economically in a number of ways. But it's still happening. It's happening in ways we don't see. So I did a little digging this week on the subject of what I call invisible Social Security cuts. And what I mean by that is administrative cuts to the administrative budget, which result in people not receiving their benefits in a timely fashion or sometimes not at all. Now, why would people do that? If you've earned the benefit, if you have a right to it, if it's paid for out of its own funds and can't contribute to the overall deficit, why would this happen? Well, first we'll talk a little bit about how these invisible cuts work. If you're one of the people who used to receive a statement in the mail that said, based on your earnings thus far, your benefits, should you retire at age 65, would be X per month until your death. Did you ever get one of those? I know I did, and other people have as well. Have you got one lately? I know I haven't. Neither have other people. Why? Because it was decided to eliminate the mailing of these benefits from the Social Security budget. How much did that save? Well, we got big fanfare about this. We're saving $70 million a year. Well, $70 million a year is nothing. And here's why. Because Social Security is it may be the most efficiently run benefit program in the entire country. You look at employer retirement programs, for example, let's say a 401k. The money manager alone on a 401k charges anywhere from 2.5% as a fee on up, even though they don't do any better than the stock market as a whole. You could just throw that into a stock market fund or, do anything, just to index it to the stock market in some way, not have these people, not pay the 2.5%, it would do just as well. So these guys are skimming 2.5% off the top, plus their administrative costs for the employer and everything. Total administrative costs of Social Security, less than 1%. Incredibly efficient program. So why do we need to keep cutting it? It's actually too low at this point. The waiting time for Social Security disability benefits, for example, is more than a year. Now think about that for a second. You pay Social Security insurance if you pay a payroll tax every week. In return for that Social Security index payment, that FICA tax, in return for paying that, you're supposed to get disability insurance if you're disabled. It helps children, it helps adults, it helps families. It's something we've all agreed as a society we should have. Yet if you get injured and there's a question about it, or the facts are not clear, the medical condition is not clear, you have to go without a check for more than a year because they're saving 0.001% on the administration by laying off government workers in these field offices, which is where they're doing the layoffs now and are planning to do more. Really? First of all, it's never a great idea to lay anybody off in an economy like this. But so that disabled people can go without their benefits, is that something we want to do? Wait times, the connect times, the ability to get through on the telephone when you call in to find out something about your Social Security benefits, that's doubled. So let's get this right. They're cutting back. They're not sending out those mailings anymore. They're cutting back on the field offices where you used to be able to go in and get a statement of your benefits or your number or a new card. It's twice as hard to get through to anybody on the phone. And they want to cut even more. Now, they're saying the answer to all of this, I didn't get to write about this, but they're saying the answer to all of this is, well, everybody's going to do it on the internet. See, here's the problem with that. Only 57% of people over 65, which is the primary Social Security population, are on the internet. Older people are less comfortable about using the internet than everyone else. Not only that, but they don't trust the internet as a group, as a culture, as a subset of the population. And by the way, recent events have suggested they're pretty smart that way. They're onto something. And look, I'm pretty good with the internet. Okay, I mean, I kind of make a living with it. Okay, I understand the internet pretty well, but after I wrote a piece this week, it's called "Invisible Social Security Cuts: What You Don't See," or what you don't see is what you get, or I forget what I called it. But after I wrote this piece, I decided to try to get on the internet myself because I pride myself at being pretty good on this. So I went to the link that Social Security provides to sign up, and they asked me, well, which of the follow they asked me a bunch of questions like, which of the following four addresses have you used in the last 14 years? And did you take out a loan in December 2012 for an auto? Yes, no. If so, was it with, yeah, have you taken out a car loan? Because I have. You don't know who the financer on the car loan is. You go into the dealer, you fill out the paperwork. If you qualify for the loan, you want to take a loan. I bought a used car, by the way. But if you qualify for the loan, you get the loan. You don't know who the financing company is. I tried to fill it out. Here's what I got when I hit click. We're sorry. We have suspended electronic access to your personal information. We tried to match the information you provided with our records, but we're unable to do so. You may try to access your electronic information again after 24 hours. What if I need that form today? Lower income people need those benefit verification forms so that they can collect food assistance and feed their kids. You may try again after 24 hours. And by the way, you may blow it again after 24 hours. Please verify your personal information again before trying to use this online service. Okay, so I realized afterwards I didn't know the name of the bank that underwrote my car loan. And there was one place when I was moving from one apartment to another where I used a PO box, and they used the PO box as an address. This is what we're going to depend on as the future of Social Security. This is why we're keeping people from the benefits they've earned and worked for all their professional lives? Gosh, I don't think so. That's the invisible Social Security cut. We'll be right back. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard Eskow, RJ Eskow, and with us is Amanda Marcotte, returning to the show for her second appearance. And Amanda, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure, especially since you wrote what I thought was a great piece I don't know where it was originally published. I saw it in Alternet, called Five Things Conservatives Lie Shamelessly About. But what I loved about it actually was that the headline almost doesn't do it justice. It really speaks to the rhetorical tricks and the moves that conservatives use in order to lie. And I just thought this was a terrific piece, so I wanted to have you on to talk about it.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Now, listen, the first one you mentioned was creationism. And creationism, you talked about the concept of teach the controversy, which is brilliant. You're just brilliant. And tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, the premise of the article is that a lot of conservative arguments use this strategy called the Gish Gallop, and it was nicknamed by a biologist this because Gish was a name of a creationist whose entire strategy was to basically lie so fast that you could never correct all the lies before you even got a chance to make your point. And it was like a debate thing. And you often see creationists do this where they'll just come up with a list of 150 questions for evolutionists, which is their negative term for people who accept reality. And and it's all of them can be answered, but the problem is that it takes so much. It's a lot more time consuming to explain why the second law of thermodynamics actually does allow for evolution than to just simply assert that it doesn't. You know what I mean? And so
Right.
it's a debate strategy that has sort of morphed into this general strategy on the right of just sort of taking any issue where they know they don't have the facts on their side and then simply just drowning their opponents in so many lies that their opponents just can't correct them all. And the creationists are just a really great and obvious example of this, because when they say teach the controversy, they mean they want classrooms to be places where a whole bunch of creationist lies are put up next to evolutionary truths, and you're supposed to sort of try to figure out which is which as a student who has no grounding in these things, or a teacher who.
So just you've already identified two tactics here: the Gish Gallop, named after the creationist Dwayne Gish, which is just keep throwing facts out. And this was really helpful for me because I've debated some of these guys on economics or whatever, and they're always saying, yeah, but what about this? And for example, a libertarian will say, if we just deregulated the entire health industry, then everything would be fine. And I will say, well, show me. This just happened a couple weeks ago. Show me where that's worked. And he'll say, or are you opposed to the Bitcoin use? So it's like, no, I just asked you, show me where your health thing works. Oh, so you don't think that people should have control? No, just show me where your health works. Your health idea works. So, but it's very hard. It's very easy. I don't know if you've been up against this yourself, but it's very easy to get sucked into the game that they want you to play, right?
Yeah, it's something the more and more I've dealt with the right, the more and more I realize that if they can get you to sound like you're dithering, they basically win. And it's a tactic that takes advantage of short attention spans in our soundbite culture as well. A lie is much easier to tweet out than the truth.
Yeah, and I think that also what's great about understanding these tactics that you've written about is that these are really tactics that intelligent, reasonable people are particularly susceptible to. You know what I mean? If you
Yeah.
go in there and you're just willing to fight and win the argument, no matter what the truth is, you're pretty well armed against this stuff. But if you're a reasonable person, like a climate scientist or evolutionary biologist, and you come in and you expect a rational discussion, and then someone says, well, but Amanda Marcotte is a space alien with 6-inch antenna, and you say, well, no, she's sitting right there, and she doesn't have. Okay. You don't want to teach the controversy. You don't want to discuss both sides of it. You won't even entertain the possibility. A reasonable person becomes a victim.
Yeah, and you're right. It's a really good way to sort of prey on that there's someone wrong on the internet desire. Where
Right.
you see somebody just saying something just profoundly wrong, and there's this incredible desire to correct them. But part of the problem is you're halfway through your correction, and they've shot out 5 more lies during that time. And one of the examples that I've used frequently is, because it's so recent, you've seen it just sort of develop overnight, is the sort of controversy over the contraception mandate in the Healthcare Act. the Gish Gallop is all over the right's rhetorical strategy on this. They make many false assertions. They assert that religious freedom is for employers, not employees. They assert that employers are paying for the contraception when in fact it's the employees that are doing so. They assert incorrectly that birth control is abortion. They come up with a definition of abortion that's scientifically incorrect to justify that. All of these things require an explanation for why they're not true, but like it's I have found, particularly when you're trying to write pieces that hold an audience's attention and don't commit writing fouls like digressions and other problems that just cause your reader to just give up on you because you're not well organized and you're not making sense anymore. It becomes impossible to address all of their lies except in maybe like a listicle form, like 5 biggest lies that the right tells about the contraception mandate or something.
Which you kind of started to do here at the top level. You had creationism, climate change, the Affordable Care Act, which is a tricky one for me because, I criticize the Affordable Care Act from the left sometimes for what it doesn't do. And then I find Democrats are outraged at me because they throw me in with the noise machine that causes people not to be covered for Medicaid expansion. It gets insane. And then you mentioned contraception and gun safety, and I've been in some of those gun debates too. And I guess the question is, this to me is tremendously useful. I hadn't even heard of the Gish Gallop, but how do we arm ourselves against this, this barrage of misinformation?
Well, I think we need to accept that you can't correct lies as fast as they can shoot them out. So make your decisions having fully accepted that, and I think after that, it sort of depends on your format. If you're in a debate with somebody, I have found it incredibly useful to make a rule. If they lie once, they get a warning. They lie twice, the debate ends.
Okay, that's a great
really
rule.
helpful.
And here's the other one that I will throw back and see what you think of it, which is, sometimes I'll just stick to my question. If I say, show me, I can show you every other developed country in the world as a model for how national health insurance is successful. Show me one country where your model is successful. And if they say, well, free trade will, and the combination of the free market and competition and international trade, just keep saying, no, we're not talking about that. I asked you a question, just keep going back to your question. I think that works too, right?
Yeah, definitely do. Like, if you must debate people, do not accept a format where one person do not do a Lincoln Douglas debate, where one person is allowed to hold forth for a period and then there's a rebuttal and back and forth that way. The television style debate where you can interrupt somebody is a lot better because you can do that. You can ask them to explain themselves. You can be like, you lied, and interrupt them. And unfortunately, if they're going to lie, the only way to deal with it is to interrupt as much as you can. And
it's so hard for me because, I was raised to be polite. I can't stand to interrupt people.
Yeah, no, it's hard. It's hard. Believe me, being on TV and having to interrupt people is probably the least favorite aspect of my job. So.
Yeah, I know, mine too. But listen, we got to hang in there, and I'm really glad you wrote this piece. I encourage everybody to read it. 5 things conservatives lie shamelessly about, which, by the way, I don't think you're suggesting for a moment that's a comprehensive list, the 5 of things conservatives lie about. It's just like a good random sampling of 5. It's a great article. Amanda Marcotte, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
I'm RJ Eskow, and we will be right back on the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. Our guest for this segment is Charles Kenny. Charles Kenny is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, whose current work covers topics including the post-2015 development agenda, the role of technology in quality of life improvements, governance, and anti-corruption. He has written a new book which is entitled The Upside of Down: Why the Rise of the Rest is Good for the West. And it's a somewhat different viewpoint than ones we've heard in previous episodes of the Zero Hour. We wanted to have him on. Charles Kenny, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So listen, your new book, if you would briefly, rather than me trying to do it, just explain to our audience what the premise of your new book is.
Well, the rest of the world, and by which I mean, China, Asia, Africa, Latin America, is getting richer and healthier and more educated. And some people view that as a threat, and I think that's really silly. The rest of the world getting richer, healthier, and wealthier is great news for us. It's more opportunities for jobs at home, better investment returns, more education opportunities, more new inventions, just a better world in general.
Well, let's start then with the question, why is the rest of the world doing better than it had been? Because I think a lot of people will listen to it and their first thought will be they're doing better because they're getting the jobs we used to have, or they're getting the trade we used to have. So I think a lot of people have traditionally viewed this as a zero-sum kind of situation where they're getting better is the reason we're getting worse. And your thesis is that is not so. So if that in fact is the case, and I've stated your thesis correctly, why is that not so? Why are they getting better?
You're absolutely right. That's my thesis. Thanks for putting it so well. It's not the case that another country getting richer makes us poorer. And we know that's true because, over history, the world has got richer. And when one part of the world gets richer, actually other parts of the world tend to get richer faster. So what is happening is that the rest of the world is producing some things that we used to produce. It is absolutely the case that one reason there are fewer manufacturing jobs in the United States now than there used to be is because China is producing some of the stuff that used to be produced in the US. But it's producing it cheaper and better, and that means that people who used to spend a lot of money buying tires, as it might be from the United States, now buying cheaper tires from China, and with the money they're saving, they're buying a lot of other stuff that is made in the States. And the net effect is the U.S. economy does better. So does the Chinese economy. Everybody does better. It is a positive sum game, and you can see that across a whole range of different. It's not just about trade, right? It's also about investment. United States investing in China is good for anybody with a pension fund. Starbucks is making huge amounts of money in China. KFC, a whole bunch of other U.S. firms are making rich in China. At the same time, China's investing in the United States, and that's good for bringing jobs and so on here. I could say the same about the movement of people, migration, and the same about new technologies. The fact that China is inventing more and more new stuff is great for us. We get to use it. China invented paper and fireworks, and I think we're all happy for that, right? I mean, July 4th
Right, but they've been coasting on that for 1,500 years. No, I'm joking. But now here's why. Of course, I'm just joking there. But here's why. I was interested in talking to you. One reason is that I've read your Business Week and other writings. You and I tend to think very much eye to eye on economic issues. I write on these topics as well, and yet on this one, I have a number of, I would say, not so much disagreements at this point as questions. For example, yes, more things are being made in China that used to be made in the United States. But one of the questions, by the way, I've also done a lot of international aid work in a previous life, so I'm certainly, a great believer in global development and so on. I've worked in that field. But I guess one of the questions that comes to mind is when they're making tires in China, and we certainly know this about iPhones, for example, that aren't they doing it in far less safe working conditions? So isn't that an economy? Or clothing in Bangladesh, another tragic example? Aren't they in many cases making them cheaper because workers are being exploited, and that is not something to be celebrated?
put it this way, I certainly wouldn't want a job in a clothing factory in Bangladesh or indeed an iPhone factory in China. However, you and I are incredibly lucky. We have the option of other jobs that are way more pleasant. Most of the people working in clothing factories in Bangladesh or iPhone factories in China, before that, many of them will have been working on small farms in rural parts of the country, where one, they would have been earning a lot less even than the small wages they earn in those factories. But two, frankly, their life expectancy would be shorter. They die of more stuff in poor rural areas of China and Bangladesh than they do in urban areas. So I know from our point of view, it looks grim, and it is grim, and I hope they get richer and the jobs get better quick. But from their point of view, compared to where they were before, this is an improvement. And I think the lesson is we want to help them improve faster, not take away steps in the ladder out of even more dire circumstances that they used to live in.
No, I would certainly agree with that, and I think that. But the challenge that I always present in a case like this is what you just said was equally true during the tragic period of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City, where a bunch of immigrant women of, for example, my ancestors, fellow community members, ethnic New York former European refugees, worked in horrendous conditions and burned to death. Very much like the tragedy in Bangladesh. The same argument could have been made then, but instead the response to that tragedy was a nationwide movement to improve their working conditions. So I guess you and I may be saying different aspects of the same thing, but there's a difference in emphasis, I think, in that I'm saying, for example, that the building collapse in Bangladesh should be a wake-up call that we don't trade with Bangladesh or China, where they've had the flash factories, unless and until these conditions are repaired, so that workers in one country aren't benefiting at the cost of workers in another country. You can always point to their origins in rural Bangladesh, or in the case of my ancestors, rural Ukraine, and say, well, at least they're not doing that, but it's our obligation to create sound working conditions for everybody, isn't it?
I think I would go nearly all of the way you went. I think we should be trying hard to improve working conditions in Bangladesh and China. By the way, I think people in Bangladesh and China ought to be working very hard to improve working conditions in Bangladesh and China, and that's the way it's going to happen fastest and best. But what I would also say is us taking away trading opportunities from Bangladesh and China is not the way to help China and Bangladesh. I do think that the tragedy in Bangladesh in particular was the building was not built to Bangladesh building codes, right? I mean, this is not a case where there wasn't the regulation. There was the regulation wasn't enforced, and I think definitely the regulations ought to be better enforced. Us turning around and saying, right, we're not going to import any shirts from Bangladesh until we know that every factory in Bangladesh is up to code. That'll just shut down the factories. I mean, it'll be a very easy way to make sure that every Bangladeshi factory is up to code, because there won't be any Bangladeshi factories, but that's not going to help the people there. We've got to help, not by saying we're going to take away trade, but by, other methods of encouraging them to improve standards. One of which is, by the way, for people and consumers in the United States to stand up and say, hey, look, I'm happy to pay the extra 1 cent per shirt it would cost in order to, better preserve these, make sure the factories are up to code. And I think we do need to have a sort of consumer movement in the United States that pushes for that kind of change. But it's that kind of change I want. I don't want people going out there and saying, I'm not going to buy a Bangladeshi shirt. It is immoral for me to do that. I think
right.
That's completely wrong call.
I think what happens, and I'm really, I hope you're enjoying this back and forth. I know I am, but I think what happens, I think there's a danger you came quite close to, and many people cross a line of a kind of reductio ad absurdum characterization of, let's say, if I'm representing the traditional left point of view or whatever in this discussion, that, we don't want to trade at all with Bangladeshis, or we don't want to trade at all with China. I think there's a more nuanced position, which many, many people hold, including the International Trade Union Movement and others, which says, we don't want to close the door on improvements. But, for example, one of the reasons many of us are dissatisfied with NAFTA or some of the other free trade agreements is because we feel feel they were extremely inadequate in terms of the worker protections and other provisions that could have been in there so that we would have supported the kind of trade. There is a form of trade that I think you rightfully characterized in your book, The Upside of Down by Charles Kenny, which says that there can be a mutually beneficial form of trade that lifts everybody's standards of living in much the way that you described. But maybe in our closing couple minutes, just a little bit on trade agreements. Would you be willing to agree with me that the trade agreements we have in place now are not? Let me put this, as fairly as possible, are not optimally designed to create that outcome.
I think that's fair. I would say that actually, in particular, of forthcoming trade agreements, or at least the U.S. position on the Trans-Pacific trade deal, which, as far as I can tell, seems to be mainly about trying to get a bit more money for Disney. It's mainly about increasing protections on intellectual property for Mickey Mouse, and that I don't think actually does the United States much good. I think it does other countries harm, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with improving the global benefit of free trade. So I think there are definitely bad trade agreements out there, and I think that's one of them. I do think that there is a place, definitely, for thinking about labor standards in trade treaties more generally. My concern is, again, that some bits of labor protection are, frankly, luxuries that developing countries can't afford. A lot of people die in developing countries of conditions that cost, cents, 50, 60 cents for a vaccine to cure. You start saying that they've got to, live up to labor standards that cost millions and millions of dollars per life saved, and there's a trade-off there. So I'm just saying that, I think we have to be careful not to say they've got to have U.S. standards of labor protections and enforcement. Otherwise, we're not going to trade with them. There is, as you say, a sort of halfway house.
Right, and I think it's a heated debate. It's a debate. I think a lot of people would push back, for example, in this country, and say, well, if this form of trade we're seeing now is so mutually beneficial, some of the benefits which you described involve benefits to publicly traded companies, KFC or whomever. They're buying a lot of fried chicken in Pakistan now, and so on. But not so much to the middle class, which is beleaguered and struggling in this country. So is there a way people would say, well, okay, if this is so good, Charles Kenny, where are the jobs?
No, I think that's absolutely a fair point. I think globalization is, a boon to the world, but I think you can't look at the statistics on what's happened to the incomes of the median person in the United States, let alone poor people in the United States, over the last 30 years and say globalization has been a great thing. If it's been a great thing, why are those incomes stagnant? So I think there is a huge domestic policy agenda to make sure that the gains that you can get from globalization are equally shared, and at the moment they are simply not equally shared at all.
Well, I think that's a great point that we can agree on, and I think that it is important for people who debate this issue from an anti-globalization point of view, which I would say is, close to my own, but not rigid. That I think that's a place where we can agree. I mean, we were. And look, we grew up thinking of this as a global, we're one world, we're one, economy, we're one people. We can't say except for that, and that. So I think there is a happy medium to be found between opposing the kind of globalization that only benefits the few and looking forward to the kind of world where there is trade and exchange that benefits the many. Can we maybe settle on that as our closing point?
A wonderful closing point.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us. Charles Kenny, who works for the Center for Global Development as a senior fellow, is the author of The Upside of Down, Why the Rise of the Rest is Good for the West. Charles Kenny, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me again.
I'm RJ Eskow, and we will be right back. This is The Zero Hour. Back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. And before we go on, I want to talk a little bit more. We mentioned in our interview the idea that the Democratic Party is not nearly as progressive, populist, bold, courageous, straightforward, honest as it could be. And there are reasons for that. There are economic incentives that prevent it from being so. And I want to just talk about that for a second. Look, we certainly have gone after the Republicans in this week's program, as we frequently do. They're crazy, they're cynical, they're greedy, they're frightening. So we don't minimize it. But if we seem to be a little more concerned with going after the Democrats from time to time, it's because they're the ones who know better. And they're the ones we can reach if we try. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was recent developments. Two Democratic leaders I think we really need to keep the heat on. Hillary Clinton is the likely nominee based on all information now. And Bill Clinton, who continues to be enormously popular among Democrats, hey, he's very likable. I like him myself. But he is almost the avatar of the corporate Democrat. We need to stay on him. We need to push back against his corporate messaging. So I want to talk a little bit about Bill Clinton and about Steny Hoyer, one of the Democratic officials in the House of Representatives. So look, Bill Clinton, Steny Hoyer, they're still pushing Wall Street's platform. That's what it comes down to. They're still speaking for Wall Street. Both of them gave speeches recently which showed that the Wall Street influence over their wing of the party, which in many ways is dominant wing of the party, is growing. That it's not shrinking. They're still talking, despite the failure of austerity and deficit cutting ideologies across the board in Europe, in the United States. We have the economic evidence in the economic philosophy of emphasizing deficits, reducing deficits is hurting our economy. It's murdering the European economy. And yet they're still pushing deficits over growth. They're soft pedaling it. They're putting different wrapping paper in it, but they're still pushing it. So first of all, I want to talk about President Clinton because let's face it, he's the architect and the primary spokesman for the corporatist wing of the Democratic Party, which now holds sway, and he's the personal and political partner of the likely nominee. So right now we got these super PACs being formed, enormous money, billionaire money, other money being raised for Hillary Clinton, and we've got Pete Peterson. President Clinton here was given a glowing introduction from the son of Pete Peterson, who is the architect of the anti-Social Security movement. Pete Peterson's son, Michael Peterson, gave a glowing introduction to President Clinton at what is called the Clinton Global Initiative University in Phoenix. So President Clinton, introduced by Michael Peterson, went out and spoke to young students who were brought in to a college student event put on by the Clinton Global Initiative. And what did he talk to them about? Think about this for a second. A former president was addressing members of a generation that has been saddled with record levels of student debt and which faces the worst job market for college graduates in modern history. And he doesn't talk to them about jobs. He doesn't talk to them about personal debt. He doesn't talk to them about free education. He doesn't talk to them about decent wages for the jobs that hopefully they will get someday. He talks to them about deficit reduction. Deficit reduction. This is what former President Bill Clinton wants to talk about. To this generation that's so beleaguered with debt and unemployment, not only that, the debt and unemployment, which young people are struggling with today, is in large part the result of Bill Clinton's administration and its willingness to collaborate with Republicans and Wall Street. This is something to really consider if you are a Democrat and if you were a fan of the former president. I'm a fan of his style. I am not a fan of his policies. And, also, by the way, in the last couple of weeks, which is the time period when the speech was given, Gallup reported that millennials, members of the millennial generation, are at or near record levels of alienation and dissatisfaction from both political parties. I hear people a lot of times in the Democratic Party liberal establishment saying, why could that be? How could that be? Why don't they know what we can do for them? They ought to look to the leadership, current and former, of their own party that might provide some insight into that. And look, credit where credit is due. Clinton railed against, and I'm quoting now, a billionaire spending, meaning I assume the Koch brothers, one of the Koch brothers. He railed against a billionaire spending a fortune to run television ads against you, to tell everybody how un-American you, meaning the Democrat, are. On a bipartisan basis, said Bill Clinton, we need to reject that. No, I agree with that. But you know what he didn't reject? He didn't reject Pete Peterson, the father of the guy who gave him that glowing introduction, spending literally probably $1 billion in his lifetime trying to convince you to cut Social Security when we need Social Security to be stronger than ever. Then, just briefly, Steny Hoyer, who is number 2 in the Democratic leadership in the House, also gave a speech saying that we needed to cut the deficit. Why? Because it was the best way to, quote, for America to get its swagger back. Now, I won't say much more about Steny Hoyer except to say that if he's still pushing a grand bargain that would cut Social Security, that would do all the things Bill Clinton was pushing, emphasize deficit reduction over getting our economy back on its feet. I reject that. I think most people who vote Democratic reject that. I think most Americans of both political parties reject that, and I think the polls show it. If Democrats want to lose the Senate as well as the House in November, they should listen to Bill Clinton and Steny Hoyer. If they want to represent the American people, make political gains, and fix this economy, they need to go populist, and they need to do it quickly. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. We'll be right back.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back on The Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and we are going to devote the next hour to a special guest. And here's why. True progressives and leftists are frustrated nowadays. We're frustrated because the populist views of the American majority are not being reflected in our politics. We're frustrated because the populist economic policies that would work to get this country back on its feet and address our horrible ongoing jobs crisis are not being enacted. We are frustrated because terrible ideas like benefit cuts to Social Security are popular with leaders of both parties, even though only the political and financial elites of this country like that idea. Why 3/4 of the people who identify themselves as Tea Party members oppose a policy like Social Security cuts, and yet it's accepted wisdom among the leadership of both parties? How do we get in a situation like this? Because we keep electing celebrity politicians whose personalities appeal to us rather than demanding policies that work for all of us. So we will be spending the next hour in a conversation with the highly visible, highly outspoken, highly active Representative Alan Grayson of Florida. He will talk to us about the tragic death of a Florida constituent just because Republicans want to score political points against the Affordable Care Act. He'll talk to us about why Democrats are so wimpy nowadays and a stronger, more forceful strategy that could actually work. We'll even talk about how that sense of elite consensus is reflected in our national security policy. Please stick with us. We'll be right back with Representative Alan Grayson. And we are back on the Zero Hour. And as promised, Representative Alan Grayson will join us now in a pre-recorded interview. In the first segment of the interview, which we're about to play, Representative Grayson discussed the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid, and the tragic, unnecessary, and politically motivated death of a Florida constituent. I'm Richard Eskow. We're about to hear our interview with Representative Alan Grayson. Here we go. Representative Grayson, thanks so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Listen, before we get started, just there's a question I wanted to ask you for a long time, and because it just preys on my mind. You deal every day with representatives in a party who talk absolute nonsense, and sometimes, as we're about to find out, absolute nonsense that hurts people or costs people their lives. And just before we get started, if you don't mind my asking, how do you do it? How do you walk into work every day and deal with the absurdities you have to deal with? What's your secret?
Well, there's an overriding consideration, which is what's at stake. The decisions that we make and the laws that we pass actually are matters of literally life and death for people. And I know that there's 700,000 people in my district who are counting on me to do something good for them in their lives, and many people across the country who feel the same way. A lot of people think that I'm their congressman, even if they live in an entirely different state. So that's how I go into it each day. I don't disagree with anything that you said. They're often, when I talk to members of the other party, I find that their heads are full of nonsense. It's just as bad as you're describing. But the fact is that somehow we have to get good things done for people and to try to move the process forward. So I bite my tongue, and I try to do the best that I can do and try to find things that are constructive to do, even looking at things from their perspective, as long as they're still constructive looking at things from my perspective. Last year, we passed more amendments than any member of the House, Democratic or Republican, and we did it because I gave some thought to what I was hearing from them, as crazy as it may seem, and tried to think of ways that we could move the progressive agenda forward and at the same time give them something that they consider to be valuable. I remember one amendment I came up with. We thought of it as a progressive amendment. Some of them thought of it as a states' rights amendment. Didn't really matter to me that they thought of it that way. We actually designed it to pick up their votes. And that's the kind of things that you can do if you hold your tongue, don't get too personal with them, and try to see what it is that they see in a situation and galvanize it into something useful.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thanks so much. I really have wondered about that from time to time, and now I think from that we'll switch to the tragedy, the case of Charlene Dill, which you've been outspoken about. She was either near or in your area. Is that right? This is the young woman who died as a result of a lack of Medicaid coverage.
Yes, that's right.
So, briefly, the story, just for those of our listeners who don't know it, and you can feel free to elaborate if I've left out an important point. But Charlene Dill was a young woman, 32 years old, I believe, who had been trying for a long time to get health care coverage because she had an ongoing chronic heart condition, and because of some various machinations involving both gaps, her not qualifying for straight Medicaid coverage, and I guess the state of Florida's refusal to accept state funding for the gap coverage, Medicaid coverage. She was unable to obtain health care insurance and tragically died. Have I summarized the case correctly?
Yeah, but to be specific, the Republicans denied care to her. The Republicans in Tallahassee running the state government denied care to her and to almost a million others just like her, even though the care would have cost taxpayers in Florida nothing.
So now this is an issue I've struggled with before in other states, where you've had a split on the Republican side, where some Republicans have accepted the money. I believe Chris Christie accepted the money, but basically the law provided federal funding to cover people like Charlene Dill. And there are governors like Governor Scott and other Republicans who have turned it down. And I guess just backtracking to my first question, really, this is what sparked it for me. What rationale is there in the world for turning down money that doesn't cost the government you run anything and that provides something very valuable to nearly 1 million residents of your own state?
Well, one rationale is, of course, sadism. There might be some of them who actually enjoy the thought that people are denied the care that they need in order to stay healthy or alive.
Now, do you really believe that?
Oh, I mean, look, you may recall during one of the Republican debates in 2012, when the subject came up, the chants from the audience saying, "Let them die, let them die, let them." Do you remember that?
I do,
well,
actually. I forgot.
I think sadism is a fair description of that kind of attitude. But beyond that, they're willing to essentially bite your nose to spite their face. They are willing to put up with any sort of pain as long as it's somebody else's. And I suppose their ideology instructs them that if you can't afford health insurance, you shouldn't get it.
Well, here's
the
funny
bottom
thing.
line. That's where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think I'm sure you're right, and you know the psychology better than I do. But here's the thing: the tragic death of young mother, 32 years old, Charlene Dill, who is everything that they pretend to praise in a human being, working 3 jobs, doing everything she can to provide for her children, to get ahead in life. This is like the model of the self-made American that they pretend to admire, but which the rest of us are fighting for, and apparently they're willing to sacrifice.
Well, apparently, in the same way that they feel that undocumented immigrants are undocumented immigrants because they deserve to be, and that the unemployed are unemployed because they deserve to be. Apparently, they think that the sick are sick because they deserve to be. There's a Republican candidate who actually is the Republican nominee against Jan Schakowsky in the state of Illinois, who says that autism is a result of God's anger over homosexuality. If that's your philosophy, then they probably feel like Charlene Dill got exactly what she deserved somehow, in some bizarre moral sense or lack of sense that they have. But you're absolutely right. A single mother working several jobs, leaving behind 3 orphans, by the way, and one of almost 1 million people who are being denied health care that would cost taxpayers of Florida nothing. How can you explain it except to say that the Republicans have been blinded by their own ideology? Every single member of the state legislature in Florida has health coverage. Every single one of them. And yet they voted to deny that health coverage to almost 1 million other people.
I would only amend your statement, if I might, to say every single member of the Florida legislature has government-paid health care, don't they?
That's exactly right. And in this case, what's happened is that up to this point, the limits on Medicaid have been so low that essentially anybody with any job, as a practical matter, likely was excluded from it. Now, what we've done as part of Obamacare is we've taken those 50 million Americans who don't have coverage, and we've divided them up into groups and tried to deal with each group. For instance, people under the age of 26 now can join their parents' policies. And people who had pre-existing conditions now can join existing health care plans they couldn't join before. And one of the largest groups that we had that didn't have health coverage was the working poor, people like Charlene, people who worked and still couldn't afford health coverage. So for those people, what we did is we said, there are 15 million of them in the United States, 1/3 of all the uninsured who are working poor, just couldn't make enough money to pay for any health coverage at all. We said for those people is that we will expand the existing Medicaid program in order to be able to help them. Because of the Supreme Court's decision, in which they said that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was constitutional, but nevertheless said that states could opt out of this part of it without penalty. Because of the Supreme Court's decision, it then became lawful for individual states like Florida to say, no, thank you, we don't want $80 billion from the federal government. And by the way, not only are the people who would have benefited from that money in danger, but our economy is in danger as well. Nurses, doctors, hospitals, people who provide any sort of health care, they're not getting that $80 billion that they would have gotten from the federal government to do their jobs and provide services to the uninsured. They're not getting that money. So not only are they hurting the people who need the care, they're hurting everybody who works for a living in Florida.
They're hurting the entire Florida economy, which is a great point. And by the way, the 5 justices who voted to strike down that aspect of the law also have government-paid health insurance, if I'm not mistaken. And here's another thing about that. Many things about this case upset me and made me angry, but here's one of them. Your governor down there in Florida was formerly the head of a company that got a lot of funding out of Medicare, and in fact, the company itself, although not the individual, if I recall correctly, there were some fraud issues there.
He was the CEO of a company that committed the largest Medicare fraud in history. They stole $1 billion from the government.
And so he was not afraid.
That's 1 and 12 zeros.
So
Sorry,
he
one
was
in
not
9
afraid
zeros.
to wet his beak, at least indirectly, or somehow manage to profit, at least indirectly, um, from this activity, which, by the way, was funded by the government, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he made $250 million in personal wealth through sucking on the government's teat.
And yet, somehow, this is something he's doing to deny this money on behalf of the citizens of the state of
Well,
Florida.
yes, because his business, up until recently, his business was to own and operate a chain of healthcare clinics, private healthcare clinics, that did not take Medicaid patients. And what he has done since he was elected governor was to initially shut down and zero out the budget for state health clinics, require state employees to get drug tested, which was a tremendous boon for the business he ran, since one of the main services he provided was, in fact, drug testing through his own business, and now to prevent any expansion of Medicaid, to force people into the healthcare chain that he founded and owned and ran.
Well, it reminds me of the Bob Dylan line. He can't help it if he's lucky. So this is do you run into Rick Scott much?
No, I've seen him only once this year.
Oh, okay. Well, so what can people do? I mean, I think that the case of Charlene Dill crystallizes the hideous hypocrisy. And look, I have my criticisms of the Affordable Care Act. I think it can be improved in certain ways and so on. I think we all do. But I mean, this was one of the good features of the law. Outrageously, my assumption is, in addition to the extreme ideology and psychology that you described, that there are also people like Rick Scott doing it for partisan political advantage, that they just would is that fair? I mean, is that
you need to understand that this is not an isolated instance. There was an academic study that showed that in Florida alone, we'd have over 1,000 deaths like Charlene's death every year, as long as this crazy denial of Medicaid continued in effect. 1,000 avoidable deaths every year. Around the country, just in the states where the GOP has decided to prevent the working poor from getting health coverage, the number is over 5,000 every year. And in the country as a whole, before Obamacare went into effect, we had over 40,000 deaths each year because we didn't have these people under health coverage. In fact, if you take two people who are absolutely identical physically, same gender, same age, same smoking habits, same weight, you take two people who are physically identical, one has health coverage, the other one doesn't. In any given year, the one without health coverage is 40% more likely to die. That's what this is all about. In Charlene's case, we can put a face and a name on the death, but those deaths are far more numerous than that.
right? And I think we're talking about, doing the math in my head, 11, 12 people each day dying because of this. So, you've been a great voice on this, but I know people are going to be listening to this and they'll be outraged. And I think the Charlene Dill case humanizes, puts a human face on this condition of the mass statistics that we're talking about. What can people do?
Well, ultimately, what we have to do is to exercise our right to vote. The reason why any of this is possible is because in some of the previous elections, we had Democrats in large numbers decide not to vote. That's what made it possible for the Republicans to take back the House in 2010. When I lost my seat, now I've got it back, but we're still far short of where we were in the House when I was in Congress before. That's what made it possible for Rick Scott to take over state government at the same time as I had to leave Congress in 2010 and to do what the Republicans have done. Florida is, in fact, the ultimate 50-50 state. We happen to have 500,000 more Democrats than Republicans who are registered in Florida, but the problem is we simply don't see enough Democrats who are voting. So the result of that is that we have 17 Florida congressmen who are Republicans versus 10 who are Democrats. We have a Republican governor. Every statewide official other than Senator Nelson is a Republican, and the Republicans outnumber the Democrats in Tallahassee almost 2-1. So, I mean, a very simple answer is let's vote.
Well, absolutely, and to that end, you've been very strong on the messaging, the distinction between Democrats and Republicans. Do you feel that maybe the party as a whole, or other leaders in the party, could be more blunt and more for lack of a better word, populist in their messaging, or in some way draw a sharper distinction between the two parties than some folks seem inclined to do?
Yes, I do. And I said back in 2010 that we could not let on the American people think that the choice back then was between the crazies and the lazies. Crazies in the Republican Party and
Right.
the lazies in the Democratic Party, who didn't know how to get things done, didn't want to get things done, and basically just wanted to draw a good government salary. And that has been a real problem in the minds of the Democratic constituents now for a long time. We have many Democratic elected officials who seem to accomplish nothing and to stand for nothing. That's a big problem. I think that we're setting an entirely different example. When I tell you that a Democrat passed more amendments in the House of Representatives than any other member of Congress last year, what I'm really telling you is that it's possible to be progressive and to get things done. And that's the standard that we need to hold other Democratic elected officials accountable to.
And we're back on the Zero Hour. I'm RJ Eskow. We're going to be continuing in this segment with our pre-recorded interview with Representative Alan Grayson of Florida. And we've been talking about the horrifying case of Charlene Dill, who is just one, according to a Harvard study, of 3 to 4 Floridians who will die every day as the result of Governor Rick Scott and the Republicans' refusal to accept Medicaid expansion money from the federal government at no cost to their government or their taxpayers. And we've been talking with Representative Grayson about the kind of horrifying psychology that's represented by a political party and a political movement, the conservative movement, that can actually bring itself to do this sort of thing to fellow human beings in the name of either political expediency, political advantage, or gross insensitivity to the suffering of other human beings, or in Representative Grayson's words, sadism. Now, in this next segment, we'll be continuing with the topic we were just pivoting to a moment ago, which is, why are Democrats, for lack of a better word, so wimpy most of the time in the face of a party and a movement that is so nakedly aggressive, that is so cynical in its goals, and when it is being sincere in its political motivations, is capable of such brutality toward their fellow Americans. So we'll continue now in our pre-recorded conversation with Representative Alan Grayson of Florida. We continue now. Well, this is such an important point because, for example, we hear people idealizing, we hear what I would describe, my words, as milquetoast Democrats idealizing the deal making that took place between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. But what they don't talk about is that Tip O'Neill was kind of a firebrand rhetorically himself. You could sit down and cut a deal once you've made it clear where you stand and once you've told the voters where you stand.
And it's also just a losing proposition electorally. You can't beat a Republican by being one. And it's a disgrace to the voters to have to choose between what amounts to 2 right-wing conservative candidates, one Republican and another one a Democrat in name only.
Well, and since you've helped me understand the psychology behind some of the Republican behavior, maybe you can help me here, because I've speculated about this a lot, but is it, you're much closer to it, is it a kind of people-pleasing psychology? Is it fear of confrontation? Is it ideological, that they really stand more to the center than public opinion? And why do you think so few Democrats are willing to stand up and really take them on these issues?
Well, one of it is the power of money, and dirty money, corporate money, money from lobbyists, greedy money that wants something in return for a campaign contribution. This is an odd thing, but it's true. Of the 435 members of Congress who ran for election and won in 2012, 435 of us, there was only one who got most of his money from small donors. Can you guess who that was?
I can probably guess, but I'll let you tell us.
It was me.
Yeah.
Every other Democrat, as well as every Republican, according to their FEC reports, got most of their contributions from donors who've contributed $200 or more. I was the only one out of all of us who got most of his contributions from small donors. So the money problem, the greed problem, the dirty money problem is now pervasive in both parties. If you spend half of each day or two-thirds of each day calling up rich people and big corporations and asking for money, which is what many Democrats do, then that's bound to have some effect on the work that you do the rest of the time when you're pretending to be a congressman or some other elected official. And it's a real problem. We don't really have government of the people, by the people, and for the people when it's being entirely underwritten. At least people's campaigns are being entirely underwritten by millionaires and billionaires and giant multinational corporations. So that's the fundamental problem that we have. Every elected official in America today has a conflict of interest between his constituents and his donors.
So, this is one of those issues where, of course, I couldn't agree with you more, and yet somehow we have to depend on the very officials who are trapped in this conflict of interest or participating in this conflict of interest, depending on who they are, to change it, which is a situation. So, how do we get a democracy back in circumstances like that?
Well, at the state level, people have to take the initiative through initiatives and through referenda, and they have to provide for public financing of campaigns. It's the only way to reduce, if not eliminate, the conflict of interest that exists. And it makes a huge difference. I mean, the reason why I can be so productive in my office is because thanks to our 100,000 donors who go to the website congressmanwithguts.com and make a $25 or $50 contribution from time to time, I have time to do my work. That makes a huge difference. So the public needs to elect candidates who clearly demonstrate that they can do useful things for the public, not for the lobbyists, not for the corporations, but rather for the public, like we've been doing and like some others have been doing, regardless of where they get their money from. Just because you're paid for it doesn't necessarily mean you're bought. So there's plenty of other good progressives. I'm not the only one. Secondly, we do need to take steps through exercise of the public will to try to minimize the effect of money in politics, and in particular corporate money in politics. The right wing sometimes whines about labor money in politics, but I'll tell you that when a corporate lobbyist walks into my office, they want always that lobbyist wants something for his corporation. When a labor lobbyist walks into my office, he or she almost always wants something that's good for everybody, like an increase in the minimum wage. There's not many union members who make the minimum wage. But notwithstanding that, labor leaders are the strongest proponents in the country right now of an increase in the minimum wage.
Well, probably because they understand the economic studies that say that when you increase the minimum wage, there's a lift effect for people several dollars above it as well.
Well, not only that, they realize that the fundamental problem that we have right now in the country, and this has been true since at least 2008, is a lack of aggregate demand. We have a $15 trillion economy in terms of the goods and services we can produce, and only $14 trillion of demand. Why? Because $1 trillion or more leaks out through Wall Street, through bad trade policies, and so on. And the government does its best to try to make that up through the federal deficit, make up the trade deficit, the lack of lending by Wall Street banks, and so on. The leaks in the economy. We do our best at the federal level with the Republicans constantly trying to hog-tie us to make up for that deficit. But the real problem in America today is that the people who have money aren't spending the money. They're making the money, but they're not spending the money. And the result of that is constantly a shortfall in demand that would be met with that much and more by an increase in the minimum wage and other policies that put more money in the hands of people who will spend it and less money in the hands of people who will hoard it.
So we have a kind of catch-22 situation now. We've got to count on selecting in the primary process, I would assume, candidates who are willing for state and federal office who are willing to buck their own system enough to put new rules in place at the same time as we're pushing the kinds of lobbying efforts that lead to things like a minimum wage or other economic measures that are good for a majority of people. In that segment of our interview, pre-recorded with Representative Alan Grayson, we talked about the need for more aggression, more focus, more populism among Democrats, and the problems that that we create with an elite consensus. We'll switch to how those problems affect national security in our next segment. We'll be right back on the Zero Hour. And back on the Zero Hour. I am RJ Eskow, and in this segment, we play our third and final portion of our pre-recorded interview with Representative Alan Grayson. In this final segment, Representative Grayson talks about the elite consensus on national security, why it's wrong, and how it's harmful both to innocent civilians around the world and to us here at home. Representative Grayson has been very outspoken on this issue, unlike many of his contemporaries and peers in the Democratic Party, and certainly unlike the vast majority of Republicans. So he has provided leadership on this issue. He gives us some perspective on how our misguided national security policy is not only leading us in the wrong direction globally, but making us less safe here at home. We now continue with our pre-recorded interview with Representative Alan Grayson. We have right now a public that feels, according to the polling I've seen, overburdened with military expenses, with military adventures, concerned about the morality of issues like drone warfare. You've been very outspoken writing and speaking on drone warfare. I myself have interviewed human rights activists in Pakistan and Africa and elsewhere in the world. Here's one where I've got to say I'm disturbed and upset by the uniformity of opinion you find in some Republican military circles and some Democratic thought leaders, including some of the young guys on MSNBC. One of them said, well, if you want to declare war on America, you get what you get, speaking of the deaths at a wedding, which included a 7-year-old girl. So I'm not sure she was declaring war on America. And I guess where I'm going with this is from a different angle. How do we get morality and public opinion into something like the drone debate, the NSA debate, that sort of thing? What's the shell we're trying to penetrate there, and how do we get through it?
Well, just to inform the readers of the background of what you're talking about, we have for years now conducted drone attacks in areas where there's no declared war. And obviously, some of the information I know is classified. I'm not going to tell you any of that. But there's massive public reports about U.S. drone attacks in Pakistan and in Yemen. And in both countries, the claim is made that these drones, these unmanned aerial vehicles, these unmanned airplanes that drop bombs, are attacking people who are known terrorists. And doing so makes it safer than, let's say, putting U.S. pilots at risk of being shot down. Although, generally speaking, these people don't even have running water, so it's hard to see how they could shoot down an F-18. But in any event, the problem with these attacks consistently has been a massive number of innocent casualties. In fact, there are public records now of 200-plus children dying in these attacks. And the cases have been well documented. Robert Greenwald, the film director, recently released a film that documented and interviewed some of the family victims of these attacks, including the wedding that you're describing, which, by the way, has never been explained by our government. The government never explained why it attacked a wedding party. Or, for that matter, a 63-year-old grandmother who was tending her garden about a year ago and was killed in front of two of her grandchildren by a drone attack, literally blown to pieces. So, obviously, in many cases, these attacks are going awry. The government has strangely reclassified the term insurgent to now include any adult in the area, including men and women both. So now men and women in a particular area are all called insurgents and therefore somehow legitimate targets. The estimates are typically that at least 20% of the people who actually get killed in these attacks are totally innocent, and possibly more than that. And for what? I mean, seriously, are these villagers actually somehow going to, I don't know, take over the White House? What is it that these people who live in filth and poverty in rural areas in Yemen and in Pakistan, what is it that they are going to do to harm us? What is within their capability to do to harm us? That these are people who have difficulty, finding clean water and have no sewage, barely survive mouth-to-mouth living. These are people who think that modern technology is a cigarette lighter.
Right.
And then somehow they represent somehow a threat to the United States. So that's what the war is all about. Now, as you point out, both Democrats and Republicans vehemently defend the drone attacks because they say that they keep U.S. pilots from being at risk. The much more fundamental question is, does it make us any safer? And the answer simply is no. Not only do they not actually remove any actual threats to the United States or to U.S. citizens, but they massively inflame the entire local population. There are public opinion polls in Pakistan. Just since these drone attacks began a few years ago, we have gone from the most liked foreign country in Pakistan to the least liked foreign country in Pakistan. We actually rate lower now than Iran and Afghanistan in the minds of Pakistanis. We've gone from the most liked to the least liked. And that's bound to have effects on our ability to actually to take efforts to preserve our national security and to protect ourselves. If we can't get the cooperation of the Pakistani people, we're not going to be able to get the cooperation of the Pakistani government or the Pakistani army. And that actually will have an effect on our ability over time to maintain our safety and to maintain our security interests in the region. So we are alienating millions for the benefit of killing dozens.
But what are we up against? I mean, this is common sense. And by the way, I don't have any classified information, but the Pakistanis seem to know when they get killed. So that's another way to find out, or the Yemenis. What are we up against here that we can't get? First of all, the common sense national security argument. An entire people, you create more enemies than you kill. But secondly, that look, even on a financial level, these drones aren't cheap. It's an expensive war that's counterproductive. Why? What is it? Is it the classic military-industrial complex? Is it the defense lobby and all of that we can't get at least Democratic Party spokespeople speaking up against this? That it has to be you and then Rand Paul? I mean, what are we fighting here?
The boys love their toys.
Okay.
We spend $50 billion a year on spying on ourselves through the NSA, which you alluded to earlier. We spend massive amounts of money trying to develop drone warfare so that people can kill on the basis of what they see on a computer screen rather than killing by looking out the window. And somehow that's considered to be a marvelous technological advance. The fact is that death is death, no matter how it's accomplished. And none of this makes us any safer. A former ambassador in the area, former U.S. ambassador in the Middle East, said recently that for every one that we kill, we create 50 new enemies. That sounds about right to me.
But in the meantime, they get their toys and they get to sit around in the Situation Room in the White House and pick their kill list for this week, I guess. So I tell you, to me, it sounds like a hell of a trade-off, a Faustian bargain at best. But anyway, Representative Alan Grayson, there's so much more I could ask you, but we've taken up a lot of your time. I hope you'll come back sometime. But thanks so much for coming and speaking with us on the Zero Hour.
Good. Thanks a lot for keeping your audience well informed. As you point out, these days it's very, very hard for people to hear the truth. It's just hard to hear. It's hard to get.
Yeah.
And you've done an excellent job of informing people about what's really going on. So God bless you for that.
Well, thank you, and same to you.
Thank you, too.
And that was our interview with Representative Alan Grayson. Now, we thought this interview was important enough to devote an entire hour of the show to it for a couple reasons. Number one, we particularly feel that the national security issues aren't being debated at the national level the way they should be. Secondly, the economic issues that matter most to the American middle class and the impoverished Americans who are trying to raise themselves into the middle class are also not being discussed. We feel that the debate in Washington is artificially constrained by an elite consensus that is the shared worldview of national leaders of both parties. Well, look, the Republicans are absolutely insane. The Democrats appear to be the more humane wing of the oligarchy half the time. And there are far too few politicians like Alan Grayson willing to challenge that consensus viewpoint when it's harmful for the American majority. So we wanted, first of all, to give Representative Grayson the right platform for his views. Secondly, as you know, if you're a regular listener to the show, we have constantly challenged the left, such as it is in American politics nowadays, to take a stronger stand, not to be satisfied with what we call inoculation policies that are meant to inoculate the middle class against the meaningful change that needs to take place in order to protect it, preserve it, and allow it to continue to advance. Social mobility is virtually dead in this country thanks to wage stagnation, the lack of good jobs, free trade, and the lack of educational opportunity. We believe that dramatic solutions are needed. We believe that dramatic solutions are popular. The polling shows us. We believe that far too few Democrats are willing to advocate for those dramatic solutions for a variety of reasons, which Representative Grayson discussed, including their own personal career advancement politically, because remember, we live in a money-dominated political system, and they want to raise money to get reelected, but also for what might be called the post-game phase of their career when they leave politics and want those board appointments and corporate jobs and so on. So we believe we have a political system in crisis because of money. We have an economy that is permanently in crisis because of money in politics. We have far too few national leaders willing to challenge that. Because Alan Grayson is one of those leaders, we wanted to give him an hour of our program. We will be doing so with other great progressive leaders in the months and weeks to come. We hope you'll stick with us. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm RJ Eskow, Richard Eskow, and we have a great hour coming up for you. We'll be talking with Sam Seder, the great broadcaster, writer, editor, television producer, personality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and good friend of the show. Sam Seder, of course, had the Majority Report on Air America, now available via the internet. And Shannon Moore, also a great broadcaster of the left, based in Alaska. We'll be talking about politics in their two states, New York State, which is ruled by Andrew Cuomo, who ran on a very populist agenda of, among other things, public financing of elections, and has turned out to be Governor 1%, cynically undermining New York's populist mayor Bill de Blasio any chance he gets, reneging on his commitment to public financing of education, this week cynically disbanding the commission that he had put together to much fanfare to investigate political corruption after, according to one commissioner, interfering and micromanaging that commission and keeping it away from topics that might embarrass his own campaign financiers. So old-fashioned political bossism in New York State we'll be talking about with Sam Seder. And then Alaska, well, Alaska is the home state of the wonderfully weird Sarah Palin. So, Alaska politics is always different from the norm. We'll be talking to Shannon more about that. I think you'll be surprised to find there are a couple hopeful signs, green shoots, as they say in the stock market biz, coming out of the state of Alaska as liberal Senator Mark Begich struggles for re-election and appears to have found a winning strategy in populism. As you know, we're all about the populism here on the Zero Hour. And by the way, speaking of populism, Another headline that was in the news this week was what read like this: the Citi, CITI, that's Citibank, Citigroup, Citi Foundation to help teenagers find pathways to progress. Now, Pathways to Progress is the name of a new initiative that Citi Foundation is putting together. In other words, Citigroup, the bank, with government funding, and by the way, tax breaks. So they're committing $50 million to this program. That means it's going to cost you and me 10, 15, who knows, maybe $20 million in tax giveaways to Citigroup. Now, how did Citigroup come into being? Citigroup came into being because the Republicans and the Democrats got together in 1990s and deregulated Wall Street. And then the Democratic Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, along with Larry Summers, paved the way for a bank to be created, a mega bank, a merger bank, and then Robert Rubin became the CEO. And by the way, it was so fraudulently run that it's paid more than $1 billion in fines. It's broken many laws, participated in the wrongdoing that led to the 2008 financial crisis. As a result, teens and young people have the worst job crisis since before World War II, and we're supposed to thank them for using some of our money. In fact, all of it's our money since we rescued them to help 100,000 teens. Gosh, I don't think so. Citigroup is based in New York State, which is where Sam Seder lives, and we'll be back talking about the politics of New York State in just a few minutes after these messages. I'm RJ Eskow, Richard Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. Zero Hour. What we're about to listen to a pre-recorded interview with Sam Seder. We met up with Sam at a legal conference here in Las Vegas, where Sam and I were both part of Radio Row. Sam will be well known to many of you as chief broadcaster and host of the Majority Report. Sam was talking to us about politics in his home state, my home state as well, but Sam still lives there, of New York, and life under its new political boss, Governor 1%. Ladies and gentlemen, our pre-recorded interview with Sam Seder. We're here at the Mass Torch Conference with Sam Seder, host of the Majority Report, comedian, author, writer, director, man of 1,000 talents, Tumblr, carnival barker, right? He dances just as good as he walks, in the words of Archie Bell and the Drells, 1969. And Sam, it's so good to have you with us. I'm a big fan of your show, big fan of your work, have been for a long time. Thanks for joining us.
Appreciate it. It's a pleasure.
Well, listen, I wanted to ask you a question, which is, we've talked about a lot of things over the years in terms of politics, in terms of initiating change, in terms of the frustration of what we're up against. Right now, I've relocated out to California. You're still in my home area, New York City, and New York is, well, let me ask you, what the heck is going on with my old home state of New York?
Well, from my perspective, one of the most frustrating things has been sort of the reign of Andrew Cuomo, who, frankly, referred to as Cuomo the Lesser. He ran 4 years ago on attacking unions. He also, at the same time, pledged to promote publicly financed campaigns, which, in my estimation, is a central platform in terms of, if you want to deal with income inequality. I mean, there was a report that just came out this week that furthered the work of Martin Gillens at Princeton, which show that we have moved from a plutonomy to a plutocracy. In other words, we not only have incredible income disparity in this country, it is also a function of an incredible sort of political disparity in terms of political power being consolidated amongst very wealthy people. And I think what you're saying is that Andrew
Cuomo reflects the kind of politics that that we see, elitist politics, for lack of a better term. That he reflects the politics plutocrats, whatever term you want to use.
And let me preface it with this: he's done some very good things in terms of gun reform, and he's done some very good things in terms of marriage equality. But he has, beyond that, and we're talking about New York State, which is it's a fairly blue state as these things go. And when we talk about economic policies, he has really governed like you would anticipate maybe a liberal, maybe even a moderate Republican from the old days. I mean, it's very much for the 1%. And whether we're talking about the privatization of our public education system, whether you're talking about taxes, he has cut taxes, whether it's estate taxes, whether it's property taxes. He has cut taxes for businesses in our state. He has imposed austerity measures. Like I say, he's been a champion of privatizing public education.
And let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a second. Bill de Blasio got elected mayor of New York, where you live, New York City, on a platform that included not allowing private for-profit charter schools to use public school grounds and public school resources. In some cases, I believe, taking away from schools for the disabled and so on. Now, Cuomo has defied him on that. And let me say this.
I wouldn't even characterize Bill de Blasio's position in that way. I would like it if it was more to that. But I mean, when Bloomberg left office, Bloomberg okayed more what they call cohabitation of charters in public schools, in sort of like a last minute, I'm busting out the door, almost like the way you would pardon some horrible people if you were president. And out of those 17 applications, only 3 were rejected. Only 3 out of 17. And those co-locations of those charter schools were going to displace kids from public schools. And we already have a situation where you have these private schools that in many instances are profit centers, essentially for hedge funders, for testing companies, and they're using public resources. They don't have the same type of oversight that a public school would have. We've had an explosion of charters in New York State. And look, the reality is that there's nothing inherently wrong with charters. In my estimation, they are good for what they were meant to be, or they can be good, I should say, for what they were meant to be, which is not an end in terms of what to do about education, but as small laboratories. However, the privatizers have seen these charters and they have used them basically as an ends rather than a means. And there is absolutely no data that shows in the aggregate that charter schools do any better than public schools. Yet they are self-selected in terms of who ends up in those schools, right? I mean, if you're a parent with social capital, i.e. you have more time to devote to your children, you are more invested in their education, you're going to be the one who's going to get into one of these lotteries, and maybe that kid will get picked. They also basically skim out kids with special needs, kids with behavioral issues. These kids end up, they can't be thrown out of public schools. And so this is a frontal attack on our public school education system, never mind the representing an attack on teachers' unions. So you have Bill de Blasio
come in.
De Blasio came in
and having a reasonable perspective towards charters, I think, was his agenda. And this essentially activated Andrew Cuomo, and with the largesse of people like Ken Langone, who is his chair. Remember, this is Ken Langone now, right? This is the chair, who's the former, the founder, I should say, of CEO. This is the guy who's been talking about, anybody who's talking about income inequality is essentially a Nazi.
Right.
Ken Langone, the billionaire.
Home Depot investor who...
supporter,
right.
But also a big Andrew Cuomo supporter. Right. And that should be a red flag right there. But a bunch of hedge funders basically put hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table for Andrew Cuomo, who's got a $33 million war chest to run for governor. And suddenly, Andrew Cuomo becomes this champion of charter schools. Now, really doesn't matter to me what his agenda is, I mean, what his motivation is, but he's coming out with statements after this budget passed that the role of government is to protect the charter movement. I'm sorry. That is akin to saying that the role of government is to privatize and to allow education to become a for-profit venture for the most unscrupulous people in some instances. But even if it's not unscrupulous, the bottom line should be to educate the children not to make profits for people.
There was another issue. Thanks for the explanation on that. And there was another issue that I've been watching between Andrew Cuomo. And by the way, everything you've described so far is the agenda, to speak back to that political science paper, the agenda of the wealthy and the elites, including gun control. And now I happen to support gun control, but anybody you talk to on Wall Street supports gun control. So even the good stuff fits in with that agenda. Now, the other thing that came up was that Bill de Blasio wanted to impose what was in reality a very minor tax on very high earning individuals. Very genteel, light tax in order to support pre-K education. All of a sudden, Andrew Cuomo comes around, and here's the way I see it. You tell me if I'm wrong. Andrew Cuomo comes around, he says, no, we're going to do that from general state funds. We don't need to do that. We're going to stop you in your tracks. He not only undercuts Bill de Blasio politically, but he must be getting the funds from somewhere, and if he's getting the funds from somewhere, it's not from a millionaire tax, meaning that in some way, indirectly, everybody else is paying so that millionaires don't have to pay that tax.
That's right.
That's exactly right. And not only that is he avoiding taxes, and we've seen this story before, right? We're going to cut taxes on millionaires. We're going to cut the estate taxes. We're going to cut property taxes for wealthy homeowners. And down the road, we're going to see that what this is going to lead to is a tremendous amount of more austerity. And in addition to that, of course, we've had attempts to provide universal pre-K across the state in the past. And if you do not have a dedicated revenue source, i.e. a tax that is designed specifically to fund this, it's going to fall apart in the future. And so this is just another instance where, it's one thing to give a little, some crumbs now if you know it's not sustainable. He did the same thing with campaign finance reform. This was the centerpiece of his 2010 election, getting corruption out of politics in New York State. Not only has he dismissed, apparently, according to Andrew Cuomo, there is no more corruption in New York State politics. He has dismissed the commission that he set up to look into this type of corruption. When it came time to push for publicly financed campaigns, essentially what he did is he held back. Now, you have to understand, this is a guy who specifically said, I'm not going to help the Democrats take over the New York State Senate. In fact, when it came to the point where Democrats were about to take over the state Senate, he basically midwifed a group of a half dozen so-called independent Democrats who caucus with the Republicans, so that he could have a split assembly and a split assembly and Senate, New York State legislature, so that he could be the power broker here. And so not only did he basically prevent publicly financed elections from happening, but he came up with a so-called pilot program that targeted one office of a political rival, a Democrat, a guy named Napoli, who was the comptroller. This is a guy who's been working for 20 years to bring about this publicly financed campaign. It's a matching system. You give $200, the New York State government will match it 6-1, essentially. And they came up with a program that was only that one race for 1 year. And it was a horrible program where the money would actually be taken out of the comptroller. One of his key jobs is to say, if we've got a big pool of money that is unclaimed. Somebody dies, the estate goes into basically escrow. The comptroller's job is to find those people who are the heirs to that money, et cetera, et cetera. The money would have to come out of those funds. So he would immediately be in a conflict of interest. Because if he doesn't do his job to get that money to where it belongs, it's available for his supposedly publicly financed campaign. He just backed out of it. He said, I'm not. With a lot of courage, because he's going to take a lot of political people. Napoli did a cruddy program, and it basically shows what a sham Cuomo was trying to pull on a New York State.
Andrew Cuomo put together a commission to look into political corruption in his state, suddenly disbanded it. Article says the commissioners were shocked. Confidential talk with an anonymous commissioner who says he interfered directly with the deliberation.
Here's the bottom line, okay? All you need to do is look across the Hudson River and see what a governor who wants to be a national figure is willing to do to get a 65% margin, percentage point in terms of a win. That's all you need to do. You need to look across the Hudson and realize you're looking at a mirror.
Are you saying that the highway political reform...
Andrew Cuomo has been closing the lanes?
I like that. I may use that, actually.
Sam Cedar, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, RJ.
Well, that was Sam Cedar talking about our governor 1% in the state of New York, who is dancing to the tune called by the money of the Wall Street interests in his state. And in the next half hour, we'll be talking with Shannon Moore of Alaska about Alaska politics, where the fiddlers who call the tune are the Koch brothers, who've done a lot of work in Alaska, exploited a lot of natural resources in Alaska, and have certainly had their way with the Alaskan political process thanks to the money they throw into it. And, Charles Koch, one of the two brothers, it's Charles and David Koch, wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal last week complaining that he doesn't like to be called un-American. Now, look, I'm not a guy who likes to stigmatize individuals. I think that's a risky road for any of us to go down, particularly those of us on the left who don't have the kind of state power and political power and economic power that our opponents on the right do. So I'm not big on demonizing individuals and going after them in an overly aggressive way. For example, sometimes when I write about the crimes that have been committed on Wall Street, somebody will comment, hang them all or something. This really, really bothers me. Okay. I mean, I think that kind of personal hostility and vitriol is very, very dangerous. On the other hand, I don't think that Charles Koch has a right to object if someone calls him un-American. These people throw hundreds of millions of dollars into the political process using the argument that it is somehow speech, quote unquote, but they want it to be speech that never gets heard. They want to speak in the back rooms and not be seen in public. And so my attitude is, while you don't go after Charles Koch as an individual, you don't threaten him, you don't demean him in any way, you certainly have a right to call him un-American. If he takes a position publicly and privately, which he does, that he has the right to use his money to undermine the political process that we hold dear in this country. That's the way it works in the country, Charles Koch. That's the way it works in the United States. If you violate the social norms and the values which we hold dear as a society, somebody might criticize you for it. You have no right to be above it. You have no right to speak in secret and never be heard while you work the political process. You better take a few lumps if you're going to do that. Charles Koch. I'm RJ Eskow, and we'll be right back on the 0 Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and we are back on the 0 Hour. We are about to play you another pre-recorded interview with Shannon Moore. We've just heard about what's going on in the state of New York. Now let's see how money is corrupting the political process in Alaska. Ladies and gentlemen, Shannon Moore. I'm interested. What's going on in Alaska politics these days that our audience would want to know?
Well, Alaska is such a petri dish of politics. The first real Tea Party candidate was Sarah Palin, and the Koch brothers have been doing business for decades in Alaska. And Alaska's so small. Our land mass is 2.5 times the size of Texas, but we only have 700,000 people. So you're able to really see some movement and manipulate and try things politically. And we've seen the national parties on both levels really try things out on Alaska first. And even now we're seeing Mark Begich, who's running for Senate. Of course, he's a Democrat, but he's running ads that we've never seen before Democrats run. And they're sort of running that there and checking the pulse of America because it's such a small group. Tell me about it.
And before you do it, here's what interests me about Mark Begich, okay? Democrat running for re-election in Alaska, which has often been characterized as a red state or Republican or conservative-leaning state, yet Begich has been very out front on the issue of Social Security expansion, for example, which I have argued, many of us have argued, you also, for a long time, that this is the mainstream position. This is not a far left and yet leaders of neither party right now are in supporting the expansion of Social Security. So I'm very interested in the kinds of ads that Begich is running in Alaska right now.
I think this is a perfect example of let's try this in a place that's conservative. I mean, certainly Alaska hasn't always been conservative. We were protested to come into the union because we were too progressive. They said, Alaska, there's just a bunch of hippies up there, and we can't let them into the state unless we put in conservative Hawaii, which is why you got Alaska and Hawaii. But it's ironic that they've switched places, and had Hawaii found oil, maybe it would be different. But the Koch brothers have come after Mark Begich, and, you know, he's in the top three, basically, of who they think they can flip the Senate with. The Koch brothers have been doing a tremendous amount of business, like I said, in Alaska. They've owned this giant refinery. Well, they just recently shut down the refinery and have left over 300 families with tainted drinking water. So all those jobs are gone. The job creators are gone, yet they're still spending millions of dollars in little Alaska media market to go after Mark Begich. And it's not playing well for them.
Oh, really?
It's not playing well for the Koch brothers.
So when you say it's not playing well, I mean, are they becoming kind of politically radioactive? Is that what you're saying? Or just association with the Koch brothers themselves is unpopular now in Alaska? Is that what you mean? Or
I think it's a couple of things. Nationally, 4 years ago, a lot of people had never heard of the Koch brothers. I think in the progressive community, we were quite aware of what they were capable of doing and doing. Now it's more mainstream, that the Koch brothers have this ability because the Citizens United, and they're doing this thing. They're spending more money than all the unions combined. I mean, those stories are hitting USA Today. People are hearing about that more. I think that's hitting some Alaskans. And then there's another group of Alaskans who are like, wait, they just left a giant mess and fired all these people. So between those two, and it's giving Mark Begich someone to run against. Because the people who are running, they're in a primary right now. There are three of them. One of them, Joe Miller, who, of course, beat Lisa Murkowski in the primary last time. The difference is in this election that the election where Joe Miller beat Lisa Murkowski in that primary, there was a ballot initiative about parental consent and abortion. And that brought out Joe Miller's people. There is not that subject on the ballot. There's a referendum on the ballot that basically rolls back new oil legislation that's very unpopular with the people and was the governor's big idea. So it's always interesting to see what ballot initiatives and referendums. You have to take those things into account when you're looking at that. And it looks as though the November ballot will have minimum wage as a ballot initiative on it, legalization of marijuana, and then a Pebble Mine ballot initiative to stop the biggest, most awful giant hole in the ground ever proposed in North America at the headwaters of Crystal Bay, which provides over 50% of the world's sockeye sand. So that's, again, it's going to bring out some interesting people for the general. I think it's actually going to help Mark Begich a lot.
Interesting, because one of the many things the right has been very smart about over the years is generating these initiatives, especially in off-year elections, to turn out the base. So now it can go both in Colorado too. The effect of the marijuana initiative there. So that will bring out a lot of interesting folks, I would imagine, coming out to vote on those ones. So I'm looking forward to that.
Common sense things, minimum wage. You want to get those people to the polls. And certainly the Republican Party across the country, and certainly in my state, has tried to make it harder for people to vote. Saying Alaska was part of the Voting Rights Act. It was like the South and the left. And it was because our indigenous people had been disenfranchised so many times. We have a governor now who doesn't want to print our ballots in Nupiaq language and Yupik and in these native languages that have been spoken in Alaska for 10,000 years. It's really sort of the hubris of that.
Right.
It's whenever people say English only, I'm like, how's your Navajo?
Right. Their immigration
reform means not letting the Europeans, run over the. They moved too slowly on their immigration. That was their problem. But
and letting British Petroleum
petroleum come in here and take all of our resources and get subsidized and kill people. I mean, isn't that some sort of foreign problem? I don't know.
Right.
We never hear about the immigrant companies.
Right, absolutely. And now,
Oil in Alaska, a lot of people don't realize Alaskan citizens get something for the oil, don't they? I mean, isn't there some sort of payout or something? How does that work?
Well, it's actually a remarkable program,
And it was designed by Republicans, and I find it remarkably socialistic.
right, that's why I'm bringing it up.
It's so socialistic. I'm always like, Happy Socialism Day, whenever the permanent fund comes out. And basically what happened was in our Constitution, which the man who wrote it is still alive, Vic Fisher, and I mean, if I want to know what the founders of Alaska meant, I call him and ask him. It's really a remarkable thing.
Yeah.
I had a dinner party once.
Calling
Or
Jeffrey.
somebody
Yeah.
else?
Once Tom and Louise Hartman were in Alaska. And I thought, who would Tom Hartman want to meet? You know, because I know lots of people that would want to meet him. And I was like, Vic Fisher. The two of them discussed our Constitution at great length at this party. But in our Constitution, it basically said that all sub resources, oil, gas, coal, gold, all of it, was owned by the citizens of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So you couldn't ever pull a Jed Clampett. I mean, even if you found oil on your land, it belongs to the people of Alaska. It doesn't belong to you. The subsurface rights. So what they decided to do, Jay Hammond, Clem Tillion, two Republican statesmen who are still, people I loved and adored, they set up this thing where all of our oil wealth went into the coffers, and then the interest from that would go into this permanent fund, and that the citizens of Alaska would be paid dividends like we're shareholders every year from that. And it's just the interest. Right now it's at about $45 billion. And
divided equally.
Yeah.
So it's just in good socialism
fashion, shared equally among the population. So how big's the check?
Really
interesting argument about that as to should we do more, or should you get a higher amount of the share if you've been here longer? For instance, like I was born in Alaska. Am I as entitled as someone who's been there for 1 year residency? They decided we're going to have an even playing field. You want to come to Alaska, you want to invest here, you want to have your life here, we're going to consider you equal. And so everyone gets the same percent. And it depends on what the stock market is doing, because that money that's in there is invested in all sorts of ways. It's interesting that Norway came and studied our permanent fund in Alaska, started their own. They started their own after we started ours. They have an ethics board. They do not give dividends. They've got over $600 billion in it.
What are they doing with the money? Before I get back to the
personal question I want to ask you about it. What is Norway doing with the money? They're not handing it out?
They don't.
Well,
they're using it for government.
There's something.
Yeah. And they also own their own oil company. They have a state-owned oil company that actually bids and drills in Alaska. I mean, they're way more progressive and on top of it than I think Alaska's been. But,
how big was your check last year?
And
for everybody else's, so it's not such a personal question.
Well, here's the thing. I haven't taken a permanent fund check in years because I'm very critical of the oil companies.
Okay.
But they're
what did it have been?
I think it was like $1,100 last year.
That's a lot of money.
I think the lowest one, I started getting them when I was 10 years old, I think.
How long? 10?
When I was 10 was when they invented this whole thing.
Okay.
And the
so
first year was
Wow.
And so, and you can do things like you can sign your child up, and theirs goes into an account with other kids' accounts, and then when they're 18, they've got money for school. I mean, there's a program called Take That Give, and people give money to charities just from their dividend, to the Wake Foundation or the Food Bank or things like this. I mean, it's definitely.
So here's where I'm going.
This in my head. Now we talk, right? Is the United States government invented the internet. People are making hundreds of billions of dollars off the internet. I'd like to see us divide some of that money up among the American people. The United States government, Federal Reserve, rescued a bunch of banks. Why don't we have an ownership stake in the profits of those? I mean, my point being, of course, that this is socialism. These are basically
The fire department is socialism.
Of course it is. But
We make agreements in our society all the time that are very socialistic, and people throw around the word socialism like they don't participate. But I just think it's a lack of education. People don't understand. I mean, when they call you like a socialist, communist, Nazi, it's like you realize none of those things line up. I cannot be all of these things. Pick one, please define it.
Right. But
I think about your conservative politicians, of whom Sarah Palin is the most famous, but certainly not the only one. That the inherent contradiction in their very existence, unless they're willing to campaign against the oil fund.
Well,
No one is really willing to do that. They talk about rating it on occasion. It is really funny how the thing that gets me to is how many times that Alaskan politicians like Sarah, like Sean Parnell, who is our governor now, who frankly, I miss Sarah. He's so much worse than she is.
I didn't know
He's
that.
absolutely horrific. And he's very much an ALEC star, American Legislative Exchange Council. He's this sort of bizarre evangelical who's actually a true believer, not just like when it's good for the crowd, they're the scary guy. But how many times did they come out and they're like, we don't need the federal government. The federal government exists, and they're always suing the federal government over something, like voting rights. Like Alaska signed on with Shelby, Alabama, for the Supreme Court case recently. So
the voting rights case.
For the voting rights case. But what's so incredible to me is a third of the people in Alaska are employed by the government. It's the biggest employer. Every single time they say, we're going to get rid of those airplanes out on base, everybody's flying to D.C. No, you can't move those planes. You can't deal without the federal money. And it's so much of our politics is like this, bratty teenager that's like, you can't tell me what to do. Hey, can I have $20 for gas? And you're like, what? Like, I can tell you what to do if I'm paying for your gas all the time. And Ted Stevens for a year, he was our senator for years before, and before he died. Ted, Frank Murkowski was our senator, Don Young, who's been there since I was a child, the last person to beat Don Young in a race. He's our only congressman, right? The last person to beat him was Mark Begich's father, and he was dead. He had died in a plane crash. Nick Begich had in October, and he still won. Everybody knew he was dead. He still won that election. But what those three and
running,
what they all ran on was we will. Yeah, I did. We'll bring back the bacon. We will bring back the bacon to Alaska. We will go and get these projects for Alaska. And it was all about this Robin Hood complex. And frankly, Alaska's a really good investment for the federal government to be putting money in for infrastructure because it's a new state. We haven't had the hundreds of years that Massachusetts has had or other states, but that's what they ran on. And now all of a sudden it's so vilified, like, whoa, it's like we've been running up the tab for years.
What should we be looking for in this? What's going to tell us in the coming 6 months how this election is going to go? What are the signs? Who are the players? We've got Begich. The governor is not up for re-election this year. Oh, he is. Okay, who's his opponent?
He has two. He has one who's a moderate named Bill Walker, and he has one who's a Democrat who also happens to be Alaskan native named Byron Malott.
Are those two going to
draw votes off from each other? And
I think it's much. I think the independent's going to really pull from Parnell. I mean, he's an incredible person. I like him very much. Mr. Walker is an attorney in Alaska. He was born and raised there. He's there through the '64 earthquake, helped rebuild Alaska. He's very socially conservative, but he also doesn't believe that those things need to be discussed in politics. He believes in, funding education and infrastructure and those sort of things. And so either one of those choices I think would be better. But, I don't think we've ever had a governor that has done so much damage as Sean Parnell has. And he's so under the radar because he's not failing.
If the national media
would pay a tenth amount of interest in Sean Parnell as they do in a governor that quit on us and moved to Arizona, we'd have been rid of him.
Well,
Very
that's
interesting. And I guess what I'll leave with is where we began, which is we began with you saying that they were running some interesting ads on the Democratic side, and specifically Begich. What are those ads?
Basically, like, these two rich bastards are trying to come in here and buy my seat. They're full of it. They're not telling the truth. They're running ads with, like, some woman from Maryland, saying, I can't trust Senator Begich. And he's like, I don't even know that woman. She's never had a chance to vote for me. She lives in Maryland. Like, who do they think you are, Alaska? Do they think you're stupid? I don't think you're stupid. I mean, he's going after them and saying, he's basically running against the Koch brothers.
Well, these are
I've wanted the Democrats, and we've all wanted the Democrats to run for many years now. So we'll be very interested to see how it plays out.
As I was saying, Alaska's a petri dish where people are trying things. The Democratic Party is trying this. They are trying this in Alaska, and it's been very effective. And I've heard the consultants for the opposition, the people running against Mark Begich, going, this is really effective.
And
because he's not running against their clients. He's running against two guys that are easily vilified at this point.
And now
Charles Koch writing editorials in the Wall Street Journal saying they're picking on me. So something is working.
Feel ambulance.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Like, really? They're picking on you. Shut up.
Right.
You big baby.
If you want to spend
billions of dollars interfering in the democratic process, my attitude is you violated our social norms of what we hold dear and sacred in this country, and people are going to criticize you for it. And sorry, if you don't like it, take your billions and go home.
Right. Suck it. That's just that's kind of my catch-all for people like, there's bumper stickers that say "suck it up, Buttercup," because that's what I said to Sarah Palin when she whined that I was mean to her. Yeah, I'm just like, suck it. They take their problems to Jesus because I'm full. I'm just so full. And what kind of fairness can they possibly expect to be extended to them? And telling the truth about the Koch brothers or Sarah Palin or Sean Parnell, that is fair.
Of course it is.
Telling the truth about someone is fair. They don't like it, then change your behavior. Change how you operate.
Right. As
Truman said, I'm not going to give them hell. I'll just tell them the truth, and they'll think it's hell. So with that, Shannon Moore, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
ShannonMooreShow.com, right? With a Y, Shannon with a Y. All right. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back on the 0 Hour. And we are back on the 0 Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. And what did we learn in today's program? From Representative Alan Grayson, we learned that money is corrupting the political process, and radical ideology on the right is corrupting the political process so much that people are dying because governors won't accept Medicaid expansion funds in states like Representative Grayson's own state of Florida. What else did we learn? We learned that our national security is being threatened by the military-industrial complex and its sway on leaders of both parties. Representative Grayson has been a standout figure in that as well. We learned that Democrats need to take stronger stands on behalf of the populist majority, or they will lose. And Representative Grayson spoke with us about that. We learned that globalization can be done more humanely, although we had some disagreements with Charles Kenny about that. We learned that the great states of New York and Alaska are being corrupted by money. Money, 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 money. That's what we learned, and we will stay on the topic of money and its threatening impact on democracy and planetary future here on the 0 Hour. Please join us again next week. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the 0 Hour.